Good morning, and thank you for that. Give me a minute because I am not, that's not the right one I wanted. I am not a Zoom specialist, much better at Teams. I keep on clicking the wrong thing. There it is, share screen. We'll get this anyway. So good morning. My name is Rich. I'm going to talk about myself in just a second. But I'm going to talk about PKI management in the ICS or OT spaces. ICS, industrial control systems, for those of you who are not in that, and OT is operational technology, sort of a synonym for it. Depends a little bit on the industry you're in, how you refer to those things. All right. So agenda today, we're going to talk about what's in your environment, what crypto keys are there, what devices you have, and how can AppViewX, what does it bring to your key management systems or lack of key management, whatever you have, and where they can fit in or where they do fit in. A little bit more on Eversource Energy. We are a Fortune 500. We're a utility company. We do retail electric, gas, and water to based on our recent acquisition, a little bit over 4.5 million customers. And perhaps relevant for this one, for those of you who are our SIP, Critical Infrastructure Program members, we're also the largest transmission operator in the New England area, part of ISO New England. Roughly 8,000 employees supported by a fairly significant contract population as well. So we're really, I know it says Eversource Energy, but we're really a utility company rather than energy. But it's all sort of, plays in the same kind of thing because we do obviously work with others. Myself, I'm the lead security architect. I've been doing it for a while. And of course, these are my personal opinions, not those of my employer. And I've been with Eversource about 3.5 years in, so I'm relatively new to this space, but I've been doing PKI not quite since last century, but close to it. I'll leave it at that. So PKI in the OT space, it's kind of very similar to the enterprise space. It's about balancing risk. So from a security perspective, we're trying to reduce the opportunity for someone or something bad to impact our IT, or in this case, OT operations. And in this case, the tool we're using is PKI, which really is just a leverage. It's to manage keys so that we can actually do stronger crypto or stronger authentication, and basically do a better job of ensuring that the people are who they say they are, or the devices are who they say they are. And the right people have access to read the data, and the wrong people can't read the data at all. And also ensuring, commands come from the appropriate place and not from somebody posing to be the manager. The other side of it, and usually it's a balance point for the security piece, is IT operations, which is, usually the more complex you have and the stronger your security, it increases the risk of an outage because you break your own system, or your own system is so secure that even the right people can't get in. So, which points to be more careful and sort of, how you approach that. But it's also a balance point to decide how much more security do you want to be and how tight you want to be on requirements, knowing that they may impact the operational side. In the OT space, this becomes much more problematic because above the CIA triad, at least for us, is a safety. And safety becomes not quite, it's literally the third rail, but it becomes a real problem point in the terms of you have to be able to shut something off on demand and bypass a lot of security things. So safety controls will bypass security in many cases. But of course, that presents a security risk, doesn't it? So it's an interesting balance point. I think every company has to look at their operations and their risks and how you perceive your risks and what your business management, what kind of risk are they willing to tolerate and which would they rather take on? A little bit more security risk or a little bit more safety risk. And of course, they don't want any of it, but that's sort of, you can't really do that. So in our case, for our OT environment, which is primarily most of our business is electrical, so we find use cases in our data center for our operations device. We have a separate data center networks that run all the control workstations, the actual controlling software, the control applications, all the the network infrastructure that supports that. from the fiber channel cards and from the dark fiber that runs throughout our operating network, up to the workstations that they use in the control rooms. At present, we are not including IoT devices in that. We consider IoT devices not to be part of our control systems, and they're not part of OT, even though we know they have relationships to it. An electrical meter, if it's not a controlling meter, it's just a reading, is not really part of our control system. So we don't include those. Though IoT devices are of great concern to us in the future, but that's not what we're going to talk about today. There's devices on our control systems that host their own little local web servers that they use so you can do direct-to-device management. On some of them, they vary, whether it's a relay or other control points. We have IT infrastructure management portals, whether it's a domain controller, whether it's your anti-malware software consoles, which you may have 1, 2, or more. Your IT management consoles, whether it's SCCM or you're using something else for your Linux machines, or you have some sort of control thing that controls a bunch of relays or things like that. But there's a lot of management portals that come with the computer side of it, separate in addition to the actual operational structure themselves. Network encryption happens sometimes, whether it may be on a remote link. It's a VPN connection to a remote site. Instead of using a dedicated fire line, it may be a leased line that you use to control a remote operational place. Sometimes within the network, you may have encryption as well on certain segments. All depends on your network. And my experience has been to show there's a little bit of everything, and it's not necessarily completely planned out. There's a lot of organic growth, particularly with acquisitions in this space. And the other thing, of course, you get client server apps. In order to get to console, the client, it's a TLS session. So the server has to be authenticated, and in most of the cases, the client has to be authenticated as well. So these are all places where you may see PKI, you may have it already in use. The other piece of it related, which is a little bit different, is the SSH key management. There's a number of devices with SSH keys, which don't work quite the way as an X509 cert. But does play into the AppViewX space, which is why it's mentioned here. But typically you get those with no expiration dates. You get the constant prompting every time you connect to a new server. It's going to prompt you to say, hey, is this the server you meant to do to? And if you read the fine text, it says, make sure you validate this. And nobody ever does. Everybody just says accept, because of course they know there's nobody else on this network because it's a restricted network or a secured network. And therefore everything on it is legitimate, which is a nice approach, but that's an assumption. And are we at that point where we need to validate that and make sure that the device you're going to is the device you really think you're going to, and that somebody hasn't, an attacker hasn't done something, with a typical DNS poisoning attack or an ARP poisoning attack against your client or against the infrastructure? How tight it really is that network when we say it's secured? How confident do we feel about that, given that most of us in the energy utility sectors have a certain amount of target painting on our back already. So definitely an area of concern. The next area we ran into is sort of what's on your network. And it seems like basic security stuff. And if you're in a SIP program, this is something you're mandated to do. I'm sorry, SIP, CIP, the Critical Infrastructure Program, mandated by the Department of Energy, or NERC really, for electrical transmission operators. But really the key thing is what's on your network, because if you know what's supposed to be there, what really is there, then you can identify what's new, what does not belong. In our environment, there's a certain amount of this being spreadsheet based because we don't have automated tools, or we're not mature enough yet to have that kind of tool set. So it is managed there, but it's manual, it's spreadsheets. Typically, we don't run a lot of auto discovery to discover new IPs. We wait for the network traffic to hit, and then we go, oh, that's something new. Does that belong? And in our case, we do not scan our OT networks. We've run into issues before. We'll talk about it a little bit later. But it means we don't have a lot of automated tools for discovery of what's really on the network, or at least the fact that there is a device on that. And of course, we do port management at the switch level so that we can enable and disable ports only by request, documented change process for what we're turning it on for this reason, and we're assuming that they plugged in the actual legitimate device that's supposed to be there. But there's not a lot of validation of that. It's a lot of trust there and not so much verification. In our environment, it's relatively small. There's not a lot of servers there. There's not a lot of clients there. Would a spreadsheet be okay? Is it scalable? Is it reliable? Does it have an audit trail? Can you tell when a device showed up on this? When did somebody add it? Who added it? Is the information accurate? Did they typo the machine name or the IP address for that matter? So definitely a consideration, or be aware that's probably in place in some places. In terms of where your PKI is going to go, in our environment, we have multiple Windows domains, which means, geez, you've got to install a PKI or you've got to link or establish domain trusts multiple times. It's not just install it in 2 domains or 1 forest and you're done. It's, I think at last count, I think we had 12 different domains, and that's up now because we acquired another company. So I know it's probably up to at least 15. This is not terribly scalable in terms of IDs, but in terms of PKI, there's a cost to that. It's hard. You might have to remember which domain something's in to make sure you get the right credentials in order to install the certificates. We have a variety of operating systems and sadly, a large variety of versions, including some versions of software that might not be as new as you might want it to be. And included in that, there's a number of devices that are running software or operating systems that are no longer supported by the vendor, which brings in a whole nother type of risk. But it does mean that some of these won't work with newer tools, or our newer tools have to be specifically ported in order to support this one old thing because it's one version that we can't upgrade for whatever reason. So this causes real problems when you go in to put in a certificate lifecycle manager like AppViewX. Is will they have support for all the devices you have on your network? Will they know how to identify correctly the endpoint certificate store so that they can use the right set of tools in order to access that certificate store, either to read the certificates or more importantly, to install the new ones or replacements or updates. And the automation becomes really key there. So you need to make sure that your certificate lifecycle manager platform supports a lot of OSs and a lot of different things, particularly in this environment, because it just doesn't upgrade as fast as other ones. All right. Another key requirement, which really carries over from the business side, but it's basically the same one, which is that in order to manipulate certificates installed on endpoints, you need to have privileges. You need to have a privileged account. In our case, we use CyberArk, and we have an instance for it in the OT environment. So the good news is AppViewX can integrate with CyberArk, which means we don't have to store credentials in AppViewX. AppViewX can just request them at the time of runtime. And if you need to change the password or whatever the credential is for a particular privileged account, you can do it within your PIM without having to go and update CyberArk as well. So yay for CyberArk for integrating with platforms. So that's your certificate installation, your certificate renewal. Relates also to scheduling changes when you want to, hey, this cert needs to be replaced at this particular time tonight. One note on that, and this bit us, so I would just share that, is that if you're using CyberArk, the Windows integration server thing, it has to be using the CyberArk agent. You can't use the agentless version, otherwise it cannot correctly do the lookup and connect to CyberArk in order to retrieve the credentials for the certificate installation. So little flag there. And of course, CyberArk licenses that a little bit differently. If you use other PIMs, obviously you're going to have your own set of things to work through, but we're reasonably happy with that. The second part of that is CyberArk does integrate with a number of operating systems, and they actually have a very broad list, and you go look on their knowledge base, you can get that either through your support account or through the knowledge base. However, again, in the OT or ICS space, you may have a lot of embedded devices, embedded XP. Yes, I know, Windows XP, yes. That will occur, and those are typically on long-term assets that are hard to upgrade or impossible to upgrade without significant cost. Embedded web servers, you also see a lot of open source in those. And I suspect we will see more of those over the future as the hardware manufacturers become more willing to go to a model which is more universally supported, where you don't have to have custom client software in order to manage the device. And of course, there's appliance devices. both control devices, but also other management devices, particularly in the IT space, whether it's a firewall manager or a switch manager, things like that, or switches themselves for that matter. Discovery automation. So in our case, some of the tools that we have available to us is we use Nessus. So we can scan with Nessus, which would discover certificates and allow us to see what's expiring and update our database of certificates. AppViewX comes with its built-in scanner by IP address, and you can put in subnet ranges or single IPs, and it's got a fairly extensive support there. Your CMDB, if you have one, may also have a scanner. We happen to use ServiceNow on our IT side. ServiceNow, you could write a script that scans your IP addresses and just returns, did something respond there, or homegrown automation kind of things. Just maybe your software deployment console, SCCM or something similar, may also have a way to update itself about what devices are on the network. Look at your existing asset managers, because if you have a dedicated asset manager tool as opposed to the spreadsheet, it's most common or quite common. Network management, SolarWinds or similar will also know something about the inventory of devices. So think about how can you leverage what's already out there without triggering additional scans. So there's a number of places to get that from. AppViewX does support importing data or results from scans into its database of devices and keys out there. So while it is manual, there's some work underway, I know, from the AppViewX side with some changes there to better do that better. So whether it's direct integration like a ServiceNow kind of scenario, or whether it's a manual one with reading and parsing a report, look at those options. Because adding scanners sometimes causes issues. So there's concerns with there. So some of the scan devices you scan, or the IP addresses, particularly in the control devices stuff, don't respond well to scans, even though we think of them as harmless. For some of those devices, they are not harmless. There's also a scanning impact on the network or the assets. Some of these don't have a lot of spare CPU. And therefore, if you're scanning over the network, you get bandwidth utilization, you get firewall busyness or responses, or firewall blocking for that matter. And the assets themselves may not be able to respond well to a scan. In terms of setting up scans, like in the app within AppViewX, how many discrete IP ranges do you have? How do you manage that list of IPs to make sure you don't forget that new subnet, and that you remove the old subnet when it's no longer available, or you've decided to block the scanner, or do you have a centralized scanner or scanners on the other side of the firewall? And that comes in the next one, which is managing your firewall rules to make sure that only the permitted scanners can scan, and they can only scan the appropriate targets. We're a relatively heavily segmented area. So that means every time you want to put a new scanner in or you put a new endpoint, somebody's got to go update firewall rules. So not that simple. And then the other thing it's generalized to all scanners, is do you use a centralized scanner or do you use a decentralized model? The decentralized model says you have a scanner behind every firewall on the client side of those firewalls, which means you only need to open up a rule so that your scanning endpoint, if you will, has a path back to upload its results back to the management console, rather than allowing the management console access to every single subnet in your organization. So there's different risk models for what fits with your environment and what's your strategy. You probably want to align with what else you're doing. All right, AppViewX itself. So if you install it, and in our case, we would do a separate install because the OT environment is on separate networks, which are isolated from our main IT network. So our enterprise install of AppViewX can't get there, and that's by design. We don't want that separation. So once you install AppViewX servers or an AppViewX instance on your OT network, how do you update it? Well, okay, so you can do SneakerNet, obviously. Probably not the most desirable, but it may be an option for your environment. It really depends on what you have. They do have manual uploads after file scanning and testing. And I want to get you my note on that so I remember it. Sorry, can't read my note. So AppViewX does have the option of offline upgrading and updates with plugins which are packaged. You can download it. You can then do verification, signature checking, and then deploy it to your offline network. So that's available. They typically release 2 versions a year. And typically one of them is a long supported version, meaning that they'll have support for that version for over 2 years. It isn't mandatory that you upgrade to every version. And as long as you stay on one of the long-term versions, you can stay on that for a significant length of time. It's particularly for those of you, it's doing a constant cycle every 6 months is going to be painful for this environment. You can certainly go for up to 2 years without upgrading, and they will still provide support. So that's a great thing. Gives you time. In terms of the downsides of doing a second install of AppViewX, so usually our costs, I shouldn't say it's a downside. Usually AppViewX is contracted on a per managed certificate licensing. So as long as your primary contract covers the number of licenses you need to cover your number of certs that you're managing in your OT environment, shouldn't be an additional impact, or you can roll it into that cost. It's going to cost you some extra servers. You're going to have to build an AppViewX host, an AppViewX database. You're going to have several, probably more than, you have 1 or 2 masters depending on your data center layout. Probably slaves in at least every data center, if not multiples on different segments. So yes, you're going to have to pay for server licensing, but the AppViewX part is not. That's additional servers are not part of the cost structure there. So that's kind of nice. All right. So yeah, a couple closing thoughts, and I know a lot of this is more questions necessary than answers. I don't have all the answers, and I think the answers come back to what's right for your environment. I don't think there is a best practices that really works for everybody. You have to balance the risk in your environment, the perceived risk, the operational costs, what your processes are, and what are the risks in your environment.
Richard, real quick note: your screen's not shared currently. We still see the PowerPoint view.
Okay, resume share. There we go. All right. Am I back? All right, good. Okay. So spend some time on your PKI requirements. What are you trying to accomplish with it? And of course, you build your PKI to match. But from that, you're going to drive directly to your PKI management requirements. What existing automation is available for the platforms where you need a PKI? You're talking, you want Windows MFA at the desktop, and it's all within a Windows domain. You have one set of automations available. If you're talking about Linux servers and Linux clients and everybody's on their own with a centralized directory store of some sort, you may have different automation available to you. AppViewX provides a lot on their own. And so you have to sort of decide what's the fit. Look carefully at the volume of certs you're going to need. Yes, they're typically not going to be more than 1 or 2 years at most. But how many are you talking about? How big's your environment? How many certs do you need? How many applications do you have that are actually even PKI aware? And think about, why do you need to monitor or manage your certs in your environment? What's going to happen if the VPN certificate expires? What's the outage? What's the impact from that? Does it impact safety? Does it impact remote access? Is it a convenience thing? Or is it core to your management where it must be up and you have a 0 downtime permitted? So balance those risks and sort of where you want to go with that as you pick out and decide how you want to manage your certificates. Definitely, and I think we got called out earlier, how many eggs do you want to put in your one basket there? And of course, then the compromised CA, everybody's nightmares. Could you manage it? How would you respond to it? I know places that compromised CA, they're not going to do anything. They can't afford, they're just not set up in order to be able to replace that. And that sort of makes you wonder about what's the benefit of that if you put all your trust in it and you have no ability to replace it. So a lot of thoughts for you. Hopefully some of them are new and spark some interest on your part. So thank you for your time. I much appreciate it.
Hey, Richard. So we do have a couple questions if you'd be willing to answer.
Sure, I'll give it a shot.
All right. So the first question is, how is the IT and OT environment of energy and utilities companies? Does the expanded attack surface, geographical, decentralized IT and OT environment, et cetera, make it more susceptible to attack? What steps should be taken to mitigate the risks?
Well, from our perspective, we don't have terribly decentralized IT. It's decentralized in the sense that there's 3 operating centers. and any one of those three could run our whole grid. And it's backup, it's redundancy kind of setup. So while it says it's decentralized, it's only limited decentralization. So, and in our perspective, they're all on the same network. So it's not like there's a new access point or really public exposure point there just because it's decentralized. So they're all still operating within the same security zone, even though they happen to be on a subnet assigned to Manchester as opposed to a subnet assigned to Berlin kind of thing. Oh, the question disappeared, but where was it? Trying to think. So that covers the geographical part of it and a little, to some extent, the decentralized IT. I would say for utility companies, we don't tend to be all that geographically diverse. It depends on the size of the utility company. Are they covering one town, a few towns, a state, contiguous states? There are some very large ones, obviously, where the geographic is a bit different. In our environment, we're only 3 states, so we're relatively small. So our geography is such that we're all subject to the same storms, more or less. Hurricanes cover one. They don't tend to be terribly localized in that sense. So in that sense, we're not really any more susceptible to acting otherwise. In terms of mitigate the risk, I think it's knowing where your access points are to those networks. Where are the touch points where you could get from one network, from like the enterprise network, over to the OT network? And typically those are concentrated within a few firewalls, but knowing that you have to have redundancy and that primary operations are actually done behind the firewall, so you don't really need the enterprise. The enterprise network can all disappear, and for us, operations continue. But that's a design, at a very fundamental design layer of how we manage our SCADA and OT operations, is that we've intentionally decided they're going to get a separate network. And by design, the design goal is that there's no dependency on the IT network, external networking at all. I hope I answered that question.
Awesome. Thank you. The next one is, can you highlight some benefits of having both AppViewX and Nessus working together for scanning?
Sure. Number one benefit is that I don't have to manage scanning in AppViewX. There's already a team that's doing Nessus scanning. So that saves us time and energy. We don't have to worry about new subnets, new IP addresses, new IP address ranges, Nessus or firewall changes. Nessus already has scan access. And when they can't scan something, they flag an alert and they go deal with it and work with the firewall team or the networking team to resolve routing or firewall issues for scanning. And we're the client of their Nessus report. So that to me is the number one benefit, is I don't have to do work about it. And I don't have to maintain it. All I do is make sure that we get a new report whenever they run, whether it's biweekly or monthly or whatever. So that's a big benefit from my perspective. So that's sort of the maintenance piece of it. The other part of it would be, it gives me a reality check. Is what we have in AppViewX really what's out there? And obviously AppViewX is going through and updating certificates and replacing them. And it gives us, Nessus as the outsider has a better view of, oh, well, AppViewX deployed a cert to this particular IIS server. However, Nessus tells us that the server has not actually switched over to using the new cert. So that's a sort of, oh, something went wrong during the implementation phase, or a server hasn't rebooted or whatever. There's something like that. So it's kind of a reality check on us, because AppViewX is going to report, oh yeah, I installed the cert fine, but for whatever reason on one server it may have hung up. So it gives us a quality benefit there.
Agreed.
I'm sure there's some others.
Great checks and balances, sanity check.
Yeah, validation.
Awesome. So the next question, how do we ensure PKI with isolated OT environment? What measures should we be taking?
Like I have all the answers. Yeah. Well, with a secure PKI, I think it's many of the same things that we do with any PKI. And it really comes back to controlling the private keys, controlling privileges associated with that, making sure the keys aren't left around, that they're placed in some sort of secured storage, separation of duties, make sure you've got at least 2, preferably 3 or 4 or 5 people to validate every step, so that nobody can grab a key by themselves, or nobody is ever left with a private key by themselves. I think there's a fair amount of training that has to go with this to explain what could be done with a private key And it obviously depends on what the cert is, but I think so. If you follow sort of your best practices, so separation of duties, enhanced physical security, both for the key itself, but also for access to the key. You know, it's a safe deposit box. You need 4 people to all agree and show up in person with IDs, whatever you want to use. But it basically comes down to the private key protection of the CA primarily, but also to some extent with the others. Education is probably the other biggest spot, because otherwise people say, oh, I just need the cert. Here, email it to me. Oh yeah, text me the password for the private key. And now they have the file and the password, and who knows what controls they put on it, particularly if they have not had training on PKI and what the exposure of that key is. In our environment, my approach is generally don't let other people have access to the keys who have not been trained on it. It's kind of like safety training that you would get on operating a lineman truck. You're not allowed to drive the truck unless you've passed all the training, you've gone through the safety driving course, you know how to operate the truck, you know the importance and the risk of driving a 30,000 pound vehicle around on public roads, which is 14 feet tall or whatever. So training of the people who are handling the certs. And we don't have anything formal like you would with, I'm trying to think of some of the other examples. You don't hire anybody to be an armed security guard. You hire security guards and they recruit training. And once they've completed that, they're certified, and then they've been trained and they're aware of how to carry a firearm. Therefore, they're allowed to do that. Therefore, you trust them with an armed truck with, $500,000 or $1 million or whatever your limits. But that training aspect, I think, is probably the most crucial. The education about what these are and how valuable they can be.
Awesome. Thank you. You might not have all the answers, but that was a pretty good one. All right. So last question we got up here. We've observed recent SW supply chain attacks from reputed organizations. In what way could they have avoided it? From identity security perspective, would like to know your opinion and views on this.
Okay. So yeah, supply chain attacks. Yeah, I don't have answers for that. That's it's definitely an area of concern. And keep in mind that since I work for essentially the customer of those reputable organizations in the supply chain, I don't know exactly what they did wrong, or maybe they didn't do anything wrong. They just operated their security at level A, and the attackers were operating level B. So now they just have to ramp up all their security, or whether it's specific vulnerabilities. So I can't really speak to how they could have avoided it, other than do better security, which is not very helpful kind of answer from that. I suspect, there's a number of ways you can improve security, but it all comes back to, I think, probably the basics. You have to know what's on your network. You have to know who everybody is. And knowing who everybody is means you have to have good authentication systems, good provisioning systems. And you really have to know who those are, and you make a really strong link between the identity that we have stored, that we know about a person and their person records, and a particular computer session, a software session that's going back and forth. Are they really who they say they are? It is far more important in the cloud connected world, because so many people are relying on cloud services where there is no physical perimeter. Identity is the perimeter, I think was the phrase I saw. So that linkage between a person and a computer identity or computer credentials has really become far more important. So, even MFA, one-time passwords, is still way better than just static passwords. And so there's definitely a lot of benefit from doing MFA. I don't know if that would have resolved these ones, but that's really from the identity security perspective. One-time passwords or MFA using PKI, or MFA using anything else. I've heard a lot of good things about a number of vendors. I would say that this is an area we're still exploring. MFA at the desktop is something we haven't implemented on the OT side, but it's on our roadmap. So we're building the PKI and the management to support that. But there's a lot of other things that have to change before we can get there. So it's a multi-year process. So we're doing that definitely in the OT side. From the supply chain attack perspective, how could we, as a customer, how could we have avoided it? I'm not sure we could have, other than sort of keeping, really being very up to speed on your IPS and what alerts are and getting information about that. Really understanding what your routine traffic is so you can find outlier traffic or unusual traffic. And it's pretty hard. There's a lot, I suspect right now there's a lot of art until the first person discovers it and writes the signature for it. And then great, everybody deploys it. So probably sharing that information on the client side would have been, or on the customer side would have been more, could have been to us. And I think that actually is effective today. I know there's within our sector, the ISAC, the energy ISAC is actually does a lot of information sharing in that space. I don't know how other industries can do that. As a regulated utility, we're allowed to share a lot. We're allowed to share information more so than perhaps a number of other industries because we don't compete with our, the next utility over because we're regulated monopolies. So that gives them some advantages to our area of business. But I know that's not true of all energy companies by a good margin. Yeah, that was an interesting question. Thank you very much.